Yeah, you can go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm Colleen Boland, and I'm not an academic or a professor or a lecturer, so I rely on prepared remarks, so if you'll forgive me for that. Together today to reflect on preserving the Earth's natural resources so that we can better address the climate change crisis that threatens our cultural history and, I dare say, our very existence. When I worked in the military and including in the White House, I helped to plan many events and write speeches, so I do have a great appreciation for the effort that it takes to pull together something like this. So thank you very much. It's good to be back at SUNY Geneseo. It's a great learning institution. I was a student here way back in 1975, and in the spirit of full disclosure, I will share with you that I failed miserably to take advantage of the learning opportunities available to me back then, and I left school after only 1 year. I joined the military soon thereafter, so as such it's especially meaningful for me to be back here with you today to sort of have a do-over. And I'm hoping that the professors here today will give me a passing grade.
We got you covered.
Thank you. According to a recent Pew Research Center poll, only 56% of Americans see climate change as a major security threat. I hope by the end of my remarks today, we're going to move the needle a little bit up on that percentage. I want to begin with two images that you might find surprising and a little counterintuitive. Here's the first: densified residential housing with rooftop solar panels. It looks like it could be an upstate New York neighborhood with progressive politics and a commitment to green living, don't you think? But actually, this photo here was taken on McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey just 2 weeks ago. What you are looking at are rows and rows of officer and enlisted living quarters with solar top roofs. Of the 750 housing units on the base, 1/3 of them have solar panels that produce enough energy to service all homes. And here's the second image. In the foreground are teepees constructed in a floodplain along the Missouri River in North Dakota. It's a place called Standing Rock. I'm sure some of you have heard of that. Inside the teepees are indigenous people, and this valley where they are camped is the historical site of the longest running Indian wars in U.S. history, where decade after decade, Native Americans were slaughtered by U.S. armed forces. This stream of light heading toward the teepees represents the headlights of vehicles, each one filled with veterans of the U.S. armed forces. And yes, this is a deployment. But this time, the troops behind these headlights have come at the invitation of the folks in the teepees, and they brought no weapons with them. Instead, they brought a willingness to stand unarmed with the Standing Rock Sioux and their gathered allies against a common enemy, Energy Transfer Partners' Dakota Access Pipeline, which was built to carry crude oil under Lake Oahe. This pipeline not only threatens a key source of drinking water, but it also locks in 30 coal-burning power plants worth of climate-killing greenhouse gases. When the permit for this project was issued last July, Native Americans from 300 different tribes converged to stop it by putting their bodies on the line in acts of civil disobedience. To the Standing Rock Nation, this body of water is a living relative. To the U.S. military veterans who came to defend the members of the Standing Rock Nation in their act of resistance, this was an opportunity to take a stand against fossil fuel-driven exploitation and brutality. By December 5th, 2016, 4,000 veterans from across the nation, including myself, had answered the call. Many of us had served tours of duty in Iraq or the Persian Gulf and had seen firsthand the damage caused by conflicts over access to oil. What united us was the oath that we each had taken as soldiers to defend our nation against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I myself served in the U.S. Army and then in the U.S. Air Force, from which I retired as a senior master sergeant. While on active duty, I traveled to over 20 countries and another 5, including Syria, while working on food security issues at Cornell University. Many of these nations were where drinking water was scarce and made children sick. I saw firsthand how environmental calamity breeds conflict and threatens security. In recent years, an unrelenting drought in Syria has driven hundreds of thousands of rural people off their farms and into the cities, including Aleppo, where the displaced and the desperate have become recruitment targets for terrorist groups like ISIS. Scientists publishing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences have made clear that climate change is fueling Syria's drought and, in turn, Syria's civil war. U.S. military veterans are on the front lines of climate justice fights throughout the United States, including right here in upstate New York. This is, as some of you might recognize, Seneca Lake, the site of a long-standing fight to keep fracked gas from being stored in abandoned underground salt caverns along its shore. Between 2014 and 2016, an ongoing civil disobedience campaign at Seneca Lake resulted in more than 600 arrests and generated worldwide press and attention. Our central activity then was blockading trucks at the gate in a form of civil disobedience. And you may or may not know that, but we won that fight. One of my roles in this movement was to organize logistics and work on communications, which was also, as it happens, my role in the Air Force and at the White House. So I brought those skills with me to the front line. And as it so happened, I also brought those skills with me to the Chemung County Jail, where I was incarcerated for 8 days for my role in blockading the fossil fuel industry. Here, shown here is one of our many blockade lines up at the gates of Crestwood. And this one consists entirely of veterans from all branches of the armed forces. What united us on the line on this day was a sense of duty and the belief that storing volatile, highly pressurized fossil fuel below Seneca Lake is a threat to safety and security. I'm the 4th vet from the left, and I have just recently closed out the charge of disorderly conduct for my actions on that day. As a soldier who served my country faithfully and dutifully, I am proud of my various medals of honor, including the one I received for good conduct. But I'm equally proud of my 2 charges of disorderly conduct, which I received for taking a stand against fossil fuel build-out right here at home. While the message on climate change from the military is coming from veterans like myself, it's also coming from active duty leadership. In fact, the military brass is actually way out front on this one and has been for years, a couple decades actually. In July 2015, the Department of Defense released a major report documenting how climate change is a security risk because, and I'm quoting now, it degrades living conditions, human security, and the ability of governments to meet the basic needs of their populations. There are many other reports that sound the alarm as well. That's why our military leaders sent Mr. Trump an open letter published in Scientific American, which urged him to see climate change as a security threat as they do. When our naval and air bases are battered by storm surges and rising seas, military readiness is threatened. The words climate change may never be spoken by the governor of Florida, but I can guarantee you I can guarantee you that they are being spoken by the leadership of Norfolk Naval Base, which is seen down here along the coastline. Notably, during his confirmation process, Trump's own Secretary of Defense answered Senate Armed Services Committee questions that are at odds with Trump's views on climate change. The SecDef's bottom line: climate change is real, and it's a threat to American interests abroad and Pentagon assets everywhere. He stressed, climate change is a real-time issue, not some distant or esoteric what if. And here's our intelligence community weighing in. And I'm just going to read these slides to you, and as I do, I'd like you to reflect on the relationship between climate disruption and war. Effects of climate change on national security, threats to the stability of countries, heightened social and political tensions, adverse effects on food prices and availability, increased risk to human health, negative impacts on investments and economic competitiveness, potential climate discontinuities, and secondary surprises. We can only guess what those secondary surprises might be, but I don't really want to have a good understanding of those. The National Intelligence Council's message may have fallen on deaf ears for now, but a recent documentary film has laid out this in a way that is really hard to ignore. And I'm going to ask my able assistant, Emily, here to play the trailer of that film for you today.
We built society on this assumption of climate stability, and that's...
Stand by, we have technical difficulties.
We built society on this assumption of climate stability, and that stability is changing. All these things we take for granted, they're not just givens anymore.
They just released a report from the Pentagon climate change and the challenges it's creating for the military.
The latest report says global warming is driving weather to new levels of extremes.
99% of my intelligence told me there's an ambush waiting for me. I would get to say, yeah, but there's that 1% that says there's no ambush, so the hell with the other 99%.
As a member of the United States military and 30-plus years of service in uniform, climate change is what we call an accelerant to instability.
If you have an area that is already unstable and then has the additional challenge of water shortages or food shortages or a disaster that makes people move, then you can start seeing conflict situations.
Syria's deadly conflict, a full-blown civil war.
If we look around the world today, we can already see conflict and climate in play right under the headlines that we're reading.
A new study finds climate change exacerbated the worst drought ever in modern Syria as a consequence of human interference.
Fragile social systems just need one more shock to tip them over the edge into social breakdown, into war.
Failure to think about how climate change might impact our globally interconnected system is a failure of imagination.
The flip side of the climate threat is the energy and resilience opportunity.
As a soldier, we're always looking to have an edge on the future. We can pay now, pay later.
Pay now or pay later indeed. So it's a powerful message, and we don't need to look any further than the news cycle from August and last month when Hurricane Harvey made landfall in Texas and Hurricane Irma hit Florida to understand why our military and national security experts are up in arms, so to speak. There are 18 military bases in Texas. There are 21 in Florida. The United States Central Command is headquartered in Tampa, Florida, and hosts one of the largest military coalitions in U.S. history, a coalition of over 15 nations formed following the 9/11 attacks with one common purpose: to fight terrorism. U.S. CENTCOM personnel were evacuated during Irma, leaving only a skeleton crew behind. This is Central Command's area of responsibility, and I don't think it's a stretch to see that leaving this area in the hands of a bare-bones crew is a national security threat. A number of other military bases in Florida were also evacuated during that time. In sum, the climate change is first and foremost a human rights issue. And that's why I'm proud to serve the climate justice movement as an activist. But as we now know, the climate crisis is also a national security threat and a national security crisis. What climate scientists call data, we in the military call intelligence. Good data is good intelligence. A stable climate creates the conditions for stable governments and stable geopolitics. Or to say it another way, and this is my favorite way to say it, loading our atmosphere with heat-trapping carbon creates the conditions for violence. Working for peace requires working for decarbonization and renewable energy. If you'll excuse the double entendre here, the desire for peace and a livable planet is what fuels my own activism. So what can you do? I highly recommend that Action Public Service and learning institutions like Geneseo host a screening of the age of consequences and bump the needle up on that percentage of people who understand the crisis that we're facing. It's an easy film to bring here, and if there's any environmental groups with you folks, feel free to look at the website and bring it here. I also encourage you to support H.R. 3671, the Off Fossil Fuels for a Better Future Act, also known as the OFF Act. This act, which was recently introduced to by U.S. Congressman Tulsi Gabbard, will, and I'm quoting here, put the United States on a pathway to replace fossil fuels with 100% clean energy generation and use by 2035. This legislation estimates it eliminates tax giveaways to the fossil fuel industry and provides supporting to transitioning workers who will be impacted by this generational change. In other words, it's a jobs creator. Jobs, jobs, jobs. Meet Representative Gabbard. It's no coincidence that a congressional sponsor of the OFF Act is herself active duty military. Active duty military. That part of our government that sees the threat of climate change clearly and understands the urgency. Tulsi enlisted in 2003 and went to serve 2 tours in the Middle East, including Iraq. She saw firsthand the risks of our service women and men, from the necessity to transport and store vast amounts of explosive fossil fuels that painted a big old target on the back of our troops. She is now taking lead in the fight for climate justice. And it makes complete sense to me that a congressman who to this day continues to serve our nation as a soldier would be the sponsor of this crucial piece of legislation. And I am personally grateful to her for her leadership. And tonight I call on your congressman, perhaps not your congressman because you're primarily students, but the congressman for this district, Chris Collins, who sits on the House Energy and Commerce Committee and who is a forceful advocate for drilling and fracking, and who has voted repeatedly to block EPA greenhouse pollution rules to endorse the OFF Act. And I call on all Geneseoans and other constituents in New York's 23rd District to push him to do so. He also needs to join the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. Thus far, he has a terrible record on fossil fuels, and in his support of fracking and other fossil fuel infrastructure projects, like pipelines and compressors, that push fracked gas, he is failing to protect his constituents, and in the end, he's failing to protect the national security of the United States. So I say to Chris Collins, it is never too late to do the right thing. And it's up to all of us to show him the path to redemption. So in closing, I ask this of everyone here tonight: learn about the OFF Act, sign the petition, and write to Chris Collins. As a student here, you have a right to write to Chris Collins. I would also, in closing, I promise in closing, one last thing I'd like you to consider to do this month in a way that you can get more involved is attend the New York Climate Solutions Summit at the Harley School, which is right up the road here in Rochester on Saturday, October 28th from 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock. This climate aims to build a larger movement across New York State that is prepared to take action to implement effective climate solutions. Clean energy and climate organizers from across the state will come together to share projects, case studies, resources, experiences, and skills to tackle climate change and implement solutions. The always inspiring Sandra Steingraber, who I've had the pleasure to work with for a number of years on various fights now, will deliver the keynote address to close out the summit. For that alone, I would get there. So we're in this ourselves, I think. I think we understand that from the administration. So by going to summits like this, we can take the power back and get involved. As a veteran who's still all in for serving my country, I will be there on Saturday the 28th, and I hope to see your smiling faces there. You are smiling, right? It was a dismal story to tell you about climate change and national security, but we can do something to turn this around, and I hope you'll join in the fight, because we're going to need you. So thank you very much.
Thank you to all our parents.